It's the full set of Shakespeare as it was published during the 17th century. Let's just look at what we've got. This is the most famous of all, the so-called First Folio, published in 1623. It's 36 plays by Shakespeare. Half of them have never been printed before. It's obviously posthumous. Shakespeare died in 1616. It's put together by Henry Condell and John Hemmings, who were fellow actors with Shakespeare in the Chamberlains, later the King's Men. They're people who are mentioned in his will. They're obviously friends of his. And they take this decision, together with the publisher, Edward Blunt and Isaac and William Jaggard, the print shop owners, to bring out this collection of Shakespeare's collected plays. So the term folio refers to a size of book, so you can see that these are roughly, although not exactly the same size, and the size of book is important because this is the sort of size of book that you would expect to have a Bible in, or maybe a work of heraldry or a work of history or something. And there's something really very odd and quite radical about putting a collection of vernacular, of English language plays into the folio format. Because it's a format which seems so high status and so serious. So plays have been published, playbooks have been published all through the end of the 16th century. They've become quite a significant part of the marketplace, but they're all published in little small single play editions, which we usually call quartos. And that's a very low end part of the market. It's the market which is ballads and pamphlets and relatively cheap print. And this is a really different high end part of the market. This is what you'll buy to put in your library. This is what sociologists would call cultural capital. You're showing off something about yourself by having this book, as well as actually having it. We've got them out on these rests partly to conserve them and look after the bindings, but you couldn't really read this unless it were propped up on something. You need to be in your study doing this seriously. This isn't a book to read on the run or to kind of snatch a glimpse at. This is something which, just by its very format, requires serious attention. Well, you need to give some time and some space to it.
And the folio comes from a new tradition, really, that was emerging at the time. And that tradition was of folio making, of putting collections of plays and works together. And it goes back to Chaucer, with editions of Chaucer that were being put together, and then through Sidney and Samuel Daniel, who was a bit of a chancer because he got an edition of one of his poems published in one of those editions of Sidney, and then decided to put together a complete works of Samuel Daniel, which seemed to irk Ben Jonson enough for Ben Jonson to put together an edition in 1616 of his complete works. And these things were put together as monuments to the playwrights and to the authors that were putting them together, and sometimes being published within those playwrights and authors' lifetimes. Of course, what's different about the Shakespeare First Folio is that Shakespeare died in 1616, and the folio was published in 1623. So we're not really sure how much Shakespeare wanted to or consented to his plays being put together in a collection. And quite often the Shakespeare Folio is referred to as the first collection of Shakespeare's plays, and that's actually wrong, because in 1619 an edition was put together by a printer, member of the Stations Company, called William Jaggard, and had 10 of Shakespeare's plays put together, and actually Jaggard didn't own the rights to quite a few of those plays, so what he did was change some of the dates and change some of the stationer's details, and put out this surreptitious copy, which is sometimes called the false folio. Lots of words like false and surreptitious and savage and ragged ornaments, as all sorts of descriptions attributed to these early and mangled editions of Shakespeare's plays. But what obviously happened was that set off something in some of Shakespeare's compatriots, so John Hemming, Henry Condell, and they thought, right, if someone else is publishing these plays and beginning to put them together in collections, we need to do something to preserve the memory of our great friend Shakespeare. And so what's fascinating at that point is that they obviously didn't go to another printer and think, okay, let's put together something that competes with Jagged. They went to Jagged himself and got Jagged, working with Edward Blunt, to print this first successful collection of Shakespeare's plays.
It publishes 18 of Shakespeare's plays for the first time. So there are 36 plays in it in total. 18 of them have been published in these small quartos before 1623, and 18 of them have never been published before. It doesn't include any of Shakespeare's non-dramatic poetry, which is kind of interesting because the thing that Shakespeare was probably most famous for in his lifetime and shortly afterwards was one work, and that work was Venus and Adonis. So that was the thing that was most famous about Shakespeare, the bestseller, if you like, of Shakespeare's writing. But we don't get that here. This is an entirely dramatic collection. We don't really understand the economics quite of the First Folio publication. So one of the things about book printing in this period is that for some very odd reason, which I won't go into, there is no printing quality paper made in England. All paper is imported from France. And so paper is a really big, sort of disproportionately big part of book publication. And of course, in order to print your book, you've got to buy all your paper in advance. That's the investment really in books. So it's a big investment. This big book is a big investment of time and labour to set all these individual pieces of type. We were just working this out in our group before. We were trying to think of a methodology to work out how many pieces of type. They're all individually set pieces of type, and it seemed to be about 4 million pieces of type which have each got to be placed. It's a huge input of human resource, but also this big financial resource. So was it going to be a bestseller? Was this a kind of an obvious thing which was going to fly off the shelves?
And it's an incredibly vast project that they had to do to get this into print. If you can imagine that every page has thousands of characters, and those characters have to be arranged perfectly in the printing press before being printed, and any error is suddenly hugely expensive, then there's an economics of getting this book printed that means you have to sell a certain number of copies, which is why I think most experts agree that it's probably at least 500 to 750 of these books that were originally printed, just purely because you had to print that many to try and at least break even on the whole process. And it was, I think, an entrepreneurial adventure for everybody involved in it, but one which must have paid off to some degree because, of course, you have a second, a third, and a fourth folio printed later in the 17th century. And this book was put together. That part of the reason that process would have been so expensive is because you have, at the very least, 5 different people working on putting all those types in and printing the text. But various scholars have argued that could be up to 20 or so.
It's interesting to think about Shakespeare, who dies in 1616. The theatre at this time is a really high-fashion, young person's kind of entertainment industry. I think if you've got sort of grown up and, had a mortgage, and not they didn't really have mortgages, well, they did have mortgages, but what I mean is if you got sort of grown up and had children and did DIY and stuff, you probably didn't go to the theatre anymore, you've probably grown out of it. It was a thing that young people did. It changed very quickly, it was very dynamic, it was very easy for people to see, God, that's so last year, or that's so, we tend to collapse all that distance now. But if you think about that for someone who's maybe retired from the theatre in 1613, that's probably Shakespeare's last plays, maybe Two Noble Kinsmen, the play he writes with John Fletcher. So this is 10 years later. And my feeling is that for most artists who work in that kind of very popular, constantly changing kind of industry, entertainment industry, that's probably a bit of a doldrum time for your reputation. You haven't got old enough to be classic or vintage or retro or all those things that happen generationally that we can see, everybody goes back to, we've recovered. This seems like, it would have been to be the Beatles in the 70s, or, I don't know, Jane Austen in the 1840s or something. Everybody suddenly discovers the Brontes and says, God, what was Jane Austen doing in that drawing room all the time? immediately after something has been the thing, there's there's often a real slump. And my sense is that Shakespeare is probably in this slump. When we look at what the actors in The King's Men are performing at the time this book comes out, most of the Shakespeare plays have dropped out of their performing repertoire. They perform at court every year. That's their big showpiece of the year, and that's where they bring out, the plays that people want to see. And they're not bringing out Shakespeare anymore by the 1620s. They've got new writers, newly fashionable writers. So this is a great. That's made quite a lot of scholars see the First Folio as a sort of a kind of act of literary piety or kind of literary criticism almost. That it's saying something about the value of these plays, which perhaps isn't necessarily generally appreciated by publishing them at all and by publishing them in this relatively lavish format. So it's trying to sort of set the tone for a new appreciation, a new posthumous appreciation of Shakespeare and what his value might be into a cultural moment, perhaps when Shakespeare's value is not really particularly high. It tends slightly to minimise the genesis of these plays in the theatre, and that may be part of trying to go up market and go literary. Is to say these are things worthy of study, and these are things to be read now. They're not forever tied to their theatre incarnation, and nor is the book a secondary phenomenon after the performance. So we've struggled a lot when thinking about play printing. Do plays get printed as a kind of afterthought, like the book of the film or something, which you would never ever buy unless you had seen the film and thought it was great? It's a secondary, it's a kind of parasitic product. Or were they becoming the thing itself, a cultural experience, a literary experience in itself, largely independent of stage performance? So the First Folio might be quite an important stage towards thinking about these plays, not always in relation to the stage, but in relation to a new sort of leisured hobby of reading plays rather than just seeing them performed.
What is part of the reason of I suppose the value of this culturally, but sometimes in terms of monetary value too, because of course they go to auction for millions of pounds, is that the text contained in this book are really important source materials for the text that we see, for the plays that we see on the stage today, for the text that the modern text, the edited text that we get, and we read as students and beyond.
But there is a load of stuff in these printed texts about the theatre, loads of stuff about what kinds of stage directions we get, whether we get very elaborate stage directions or very limited stage directions. Stuff in a couple of places we've got the name of the actors instead of the name of the character. So the actors have sort of made their way into the plays. They become so associated with the characters that the characters lose their sort of fictional names. And various things about how these plays might have looked on the stage and how they might have been tweaked or redrawn for different kinds of performance spaces.
I mentioned earlier that these texts contained in the Shakespeare First Folio are not, of course, definitive, but often used as source material. That's not to say that they don't have all sorts of problems. And in those problems we have some interesting stories. So there was an amazing study by a man called Charlton Hinman back in the late 1960s. He spent years looking at, I think, around 68 different Shakespeare First Folios and comparing all of them using a special machine to look at them page by page. And his story is interlinked with, I think, with a story of what he was looking at. So I'll get to his story in a moment. What he found was that there are all sorts of errors and problems in the plays, in the printing of this text. And they could range from a compositor getting his calculations wrong and realising, how am I going to fit this sentence in? This has been printed. Oh, actually, do we really need that sentence? Let's just forget it, and you've lost it. And we never know. It's a Donald Rumsfeld, unknown. We never knew it was there, so maybe there's a problem in the play, and maybe pages and pages have been written about it, and it was just a compositor thinking, okay, nobody's going to notice this, and losing that line. But what Hinman did brilliantly was to put together tables and tables and tables of details about these errors and about spelling preferences. So between him and some of the other scholars working on the First Folio then and earlier on, they isolated first this idea that there might be 5 different hands, 5 different compositors working on this book, but maybe more than that. But also looking at the way they could isolate those hands by saying that because spelling was quite fluid at the time, different people had different preferences for spelling. So the classic ones to look at are the word do, go and hear. And do might have been spelt with 2 O's, go might have been spelt with 2 O's or 1 O, hear with 2 E's in the middle or 1 E. And understanding those preferences was what Hinman and others used to isolate the different hands. And in those hands, there's a problem, and one of the fascinating things that those textual scholars looked at was Hamlet, for instance, and looked at Hamlet having all sorts of errors and problems, and really strange errors, stuff just kind of what we'd call schoolboy stuff, school person stuff, and that play has all sorts of problems at the beginning, but then over time it gets a little bit better. And the spelling preferences of the person working on that play in the folio, they seem to reflect the spelling preferences of the compositor who's the best at it, who makes the fewest errors. So what was surmised at the time, and I think it's a really interesting story, is that was an apprentice that had been brought into the Jagged's print works, and that apprentice was learning his craft from the best, from the most established compositor, and getting better and better at the time. And so in Hamlet, what I think is wonderful about that is that you not only have a narrative of someone's personal development, there are so many things beyond that Hamlet is, but their philosophical awakening, all those things. But you have in the problems and the errors, someone learning their craft as well, I think is a fascinating thing.